All right, guys, so in Chapter 39, we're going to talk about endocrine physiology and mechanisms of hypothalamic pituitary regulation of hormones around your body. And endocrine glands are ductless organs that release hormones. So they release these hormones into the bloodstream, and all endocrine organs have extensive blood vessels because that's what they're releasing their hormones into, are those blood vessels. Now, the endocrine system and the nervous system function together to communicate signals throughout the body, and they can help achieve homeostasis or internal balance. The endocrine system is actually faster. The nervous system is faster. The endocrine system is slower, but the endocrine system has longer lasting effects on your body's tissues. So what this shows you guys is a comparison of the nervous system and the endocrine system. So with the nervous system, we have our axons that continue out to a peripheral tissue, and they can transmit action potentials, at like hundreds of feet per second until they get to a target gland or tissue, and they can release neurotransmitters onto a receptor. Now, this form of communication is fast, but it has short-lasting effects. The endocrine system, on the other hand, is where these cells release hormones into the bloodstream, and these hormones travel through blood, eventually diffusing into a target tissue where they can bind to receptors on that target tissue and then stimulate some sort of effect in that target gland or tissue. Now, what this slide is showing is basically just a summary of the major endocrine glands around your body. The major endocrine glands include things like your hypothalamus and pituitary. And the pituitary can be divided into both anterior and posterior portions. We also have our pineal gland, which is found in the epithalamus. That releases a hormone called melatonin, which is involved in regulating the sleep-wake cycles. We have our thyroid gland, which is found on the anterior surface of the neck, just inferior to the larynx. And this releases hormones like thyroid hormone and calcitonin. But behind the thyroid gland, we have the parathyroid glands, which release parathyroid hormone, which we'll get to later. And then down here, we have the adrenal glands, which are basically just like little hats of the kidneys. So each adrenal gland sits on top of the kidneys, and they release a variety of hormones like the glucocorticoids, the mineralocorticoids, and the gonatocorticoids, which we'll talk about. Now, the adrenal glands also have a medulla where we have the release of catecholamines like epinephrine and norepinephrine. Now, we have other organs that also contain endocrine cells like our thymus, our heart, our stomach, our kidneys, and our skin, as well as gonads. Those we don't call endocrine glands necessarily, but they contain endocrine-releasing cells that release a variety of hormones that are all involved in controlling or mediating homeostasis. Now, just as an overview of hormones, what we find is that endocrine glands produce hormones, and these hormones have a target cell or organ. And what determines whether a target cell or organ is a target of that hormone is whether or not it has a specific receptor for that hormone. Because these hormones go everywhere in your bloodstream, you can find a hormone in an organ or tissue that isn't necessarily a target of that hormone, right? The hormones will go everywhere where blood goes, and what that means then is you can find a hormone in the brain even if that hormone doesn't exert an effect on the brain. Okay? And what determines whether or not that hormone has an effect on that target tissue is whether or not there's a specific receptor for that hormone present. Now, in a little bit, we'll talk about diseases of the organ system or endocrine system and how receptors could be sort of excessive or blocked, and that can lead to a variety of effects. Now, if cells or organs don't possess the receptor for a hormone, then they won't respond to that hormone. So even if you find a hormone in a particular tissue, you got to have a receptor present in order for that hormone to exert an effect or have an effect on that tissue. Now, there's several main classes of hormones. We got the peptide hormones, steroid hormones, and the biogenic amines. These peptide hormones are made of protein. Steroid hormones are derived from cholesterol, and the biogenic amines are derived from amino acids. Now, all hormones typically work in a feedback loop system. And there's two types of feedback. We got negative feedback and positive feedback. Negative feedback was a system where the effects of that hormone are sort of diminished in the long term. So it acts to make changes less severe, less pronounced. Positive feedback is where the effects of that hormone are enhanced, so it makes changes more pronounced. And so some examples of feedback we see here. This is showing negative feedback, where let's say if you're hungry and you eat a cheeseburger or something. And what happens is that after you eat that cheeseburger, your blood sugar levels will rise, right? Well, once your blood sugar levels rise, then the beta cells of your pancreas can release a hormone called insulin, and insulin acts to decrease blood sugar levels by aiding in the transport of glucose into your body's cells. So if the initial effect was an increase in blood sugar, then we got the release of insulin, which decreases our blood sugar to bring us back towards homeostasis. We call this negative feedback because we actually made that change less pronounced. If the change was an increase in blood sugar, then we released a hormone to decrease blood sugar. That's considered negative feedback. And most hormones work in this sort of process. So they mostly use a negative feedback process. Now, for positive feedback, what we see here is where you have some sort of change, and then that change is enhanced or made kind of more dramatic. So what's an example of positive feedback? Well, like if an infant suckles on a nipple, that stimulates the release of oxytocin by the posterior pituitary gland. Now, oxytocin stimulates the release of milk by mammary glands, and that release of milk causes the infant to suckle more. Then you get more oxytocin released, which causes the mammary glands to release more milk, and the infant keeps suckling, right? That's positive feedback because the infant suckling caused milk to be released, but that caused more milk to be released, right? So that made the change kind of more dramatic or kind of enhanced that initial change. You can probably understand why most feedback mechanisms wouldn't use positive feedback, because you wouldn't want, like, you know, if your body temperature rose, you wouldn't want to release more thyroid hormone to make your body temperature rise even further, right? That wouldn't make sense because then you just would kind of go outside of homeostasis. Another example of positive feedback is uterine contractions during labor. Once the uterus starts to contract, that also stimulates the release of oxytocin, which causes the uterus to contract even more strongly. And that keeps going and going and going until birth occurs, right? So that's an example of positive feedback, which are more rare in the body because they kind of take you away from homeostasis, right? Whereas negative feedback maintains normality. It kind of keeps you at a certain set point or a narrow range. So in negative feedback, the stimulus starts the process that causes a release of hormone, and that hormone causes that process to slow down or turn off. So with the example of blood sugar, when your blood sugar levels rise shortly after eating a meal, then you had the release of a hormone, insulin, that caused your blood sugar levels to decrease, right? That's considered negative feedback. So eating a meal increases blood glucose. In response, you get the release of insulin, and then insulin decreases blood glucose levels. That makes sense. With positive feedback, it accelerates the original process and ensures that it continues or speeds up. And you don't find a lot of positive feedback in the body because it won't really maintain homeostasis very well. An example, this was milk release from the mammary glands, like a baby suckling on the nipple causes the release of oxytocin. Oxytocin then stimulates the release of milk by the mammary glands, and then that causes the infant to continually suckle, which causes more oxytocin to be released. Oxytocin causes more milk to be released by the mammary glands, which then causes the baby to continually suckling, which causes more oxytocin to be released. And I can keep going, right? Until the infant stops suckling. Once the infant stops suckling, then you stop getting the release of oxytocin, and that turns the process off. But the only way this process gets turned off is if you either run out of milk or the infant stops suckling. So it makes sense. And it's positive feedback because it accelerates the original process. So target cells are specific to a particular hormone. So we know that hormones can bind to a receptor, and what determines target cell specificity is whether or not that hormone can bind to the given receptor. Okay? So what this means, then, you guys, is that if you have target cells or a gland that responds to ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone, released by the anterior pituitary, that means that you have to find ACTH receptors on those cells for the hormone to bind to in order to exert an effect, right? Think of like a lock and key example, right? You might have a key, but if there's not the corresponding lock, then that key is useless. Or you might have a lock, but if there's not the corresponding key to put in that lock, then again, I mean, you're not going to really get an effect. So thyroxine receptors are found on most body cells. So really, target tissue of thyroid hormone, most of your body cells have thyroid hormone. And the reason for this, you guys, is that thyroid hormone, we'll come back to this later, regulates metabolism around our body, and you find receptors for thyroid hormone in mitochondria. So if it's a cell in your body that has a mitochondria, that's a target cell for thyroid hormone, which is basically every cell in your body. Like, other than some cells, like red blood cells, don't have mitochondria. But it's still kind of interesting. So the level of activation depends on also a variety of factors. For one, the blood levels of that hormone. How much of that hormone is present helps us determine how much activation we'll get in response to that hormone, right? So if your hormone levels are high, you should expect to see a stronger response, okay? Or the relative number of receptors too. What if your hormone levels were high, but you didn't have a lot of receptors present to respond to that hormone? Well, you get a strong effect then. So I'll just read it. I'll say it again. If your hormone levels are high, but you don't have a lot of receptors to respond to that hormone, will you get a strong effect then? No, exactly. So the relative number of receptors also plays a role. So if you have a lot of receptors present, that can also help determine the level of activation of that hormone and the affinity of binding as well. So affinity refers to the strength of binding, like how strongly can a hormone bind to a receptor. And this tells us about the level of activation. So if a hormone binds to its receptor more strongly, that means it's on the receptor more frequently, or kind of in the longer term, and that makes a stronger effect. So three things that can affect target cell activation, you guys: blood levels of a hormone, the relative number of receptors, and the affinity or strength of binding. Now, one thing we'll get into in a little bit when we get to the pathophysiology chapters is the difference between upregulation and downregulation. And the way I like to think about this, you guys, it's a way that cells can kind of finely tune how they respond to hormones based on the number of receptors they can either have present or remove. So I'll give you an example. This is the one that comes to my mind. If someone's talking really quietly, what could you do without moving your body? Like, what could you do to maybe hear them better? If someone's talking really quietly, like just kind of whispering. Yeah, maybe kind of position yourself, like maybe change the position of your head, so maybe have their ear face that direction, right? Or maybe cup your ears. If you cup your ears, you gotta make a bigger place for sound to kind of funnel into your ears, right? This is an example of upregulation. So upregulation is basically where cells, in response to low levels of a hormone, can put more receptors into the membrane of the cell. That way they respond to even less hormone present, right? If you have low levels of hormone, it's kind of a more quiet signal, right? Very quiet. Then what you do is you put in more receptors in the membrane. And by putting more receptors in the membrane, you're kind of cupping your ears, right? Then you can hear that signal better. That's upregulation. Okay. Now, what about the opposite? Like, what if there's a really loud noise? Maybe you're at a stoplight and someone's just bumping some really annoying music, and you just want to, like, what do you want to do, other than inflict pain upon those persons? What's that? Maybe bring your windows up or cover your ears. That would be like down regulation, because what you're doing is you're trying to block that signal. So down regulation would be like covering your ears. Let's say where a cell basically removes receptors from the membrane. That way it doesn't respond as strongly to a given hormone. So let's say if all of a sudden you started like taking testosterone supplements because you're trying to get buff, and all of a sudden your testosterone levels in your body get really high. What are your body's cells going to do in response to that really high level of testosterone? Yeah, they're going to downregulate. That's too strong of a signal, so the cells are going to downregulate their receptors, which means they can still get stimulated by testosterone, but they need less receptors to get that stimulation. But then let's say all of a sudden your contact for your testosterone goes to jail, and all of a sudden you couldn't get your next round of testosterone. So all of a sudden your testosterone levels drop out, right? And they just plummet. Now what's happening is that your cells, which have already down-regulated the receptors, also are exposed to less testosterone. And so basically the whole effect collapses. Okay. What are those cells going to do then if there's not a lot of testosterone left over? Yeah, they can upregulate it. You're right. They can put in more receptors in the membrane to respond to that hormone, the limited amount of hormone, better. So we'll come back to this with diseases here in a minute. Now, there's also things that can affect the concentration of hormones in blood, because hormones don't last forever, right? Like, we understand that the hormones you released when you're an infant aren't in your body today. So where do they go then? Well, we have degrading enzymes. These enzymes can break down those hormones. Some of those hormones are lost into urine through your kidneys, or your liver also plays a role in breaking down those hormones. Does that sound familiar, you guys? It sounds like drugs, right? So it's kind of interesting that our body handles hormones in a similar way to toxins and drugs. But these all help determine what we call half-life. And half-life is the amount of time it takes to reduce the original concentration of that hormone by half. Hormones have different half-lives. Some half-lives can be in the order of minutes. Some can be in the order of days, hours, days, weeks, kind of thing. So different hormones have different half-lives. But what helps determine the half-life of a hormone are the presence of degrading enzymes, your kidney function, and your liver function, right? And that type of hormone. If it's a lipid-soluble hormone, it'll stay in your fat longer, which means it has a longer half-life. And so these can vary quite a bit. Now, hormones can circulate in the blood either free or bound, because some hormones are water-soluble, some hormones are lipid-soluble. They're transported in different ways. Water-soluble hormones are the ones that can dissolve straight into blood plasma. They don't need any special transport mechanisms or proteins, right? Because they can dissolve in the watery solutions of your body, they get transported really easily, okay? This differs from the lipid-soluble hormones like steroid hormones and thyroid hormone. Because they're lipid-soluble, they're also hydrophobic or water-fearing, which means they don't dissolve really well in water, so they have to bind to some sort of carrier protein. So what we find is we have binding globulins in our bloodstream that can bind to steroid hormones and thyroid hormone, things that are lipid-soluble, in order to transport those better throughout our body. Otherwise, without these binding globulins, you guys, these hormones that are lipid-soluble wouldn't get transported very well, right? Because they don't dissolve in water, they have a tendency to kind of clump up together and not dissolve throughout your body. So it would make it a very ineffective way to stimulate other target cells or glands. Now, the concentration of hormone reflects either the rate of release or the speed of an activation. So let's say if someone had really low testosterone levels, what could that be caused by? If their testosterone was super low, like to the point where it caused hypogonadism. Yeah, you got it. So the rate of release, right? Maybe testosterone is low because we're not releasing it very fast. What else could influence low testosterone levels? Yeah, how fast it's broken down. What if testosterone was just broken down really quickly? Well, that can also affect the concentration of that hormone. Now, hormones also have different effects on the target cells. We have permissiveness, synergism, and antagonism, and these are basically just different words to describe how hormones can kind of interact with each other. So permissiveness is going to be where one hormone can't exert its effect without another hormone being present. Okay? Synergism means that more than one hormone together has a greater effect than the sum of their individual effects. Okay? And then antagonism is where one hormone opposes the effects of another hormone. We'll talk about these ones. So this slide is showing an example of synergism. So what we'll look at here, you guys, is blood glucose levels over time. And then let's imagine that each of these lines is a different condition. So in this person, we injected glucagon, epinephrine, and cortisol. In this person, we only injected glucagon, or in this person, we only injected epinephrine, or in this person, only cortisol. So you can see that glucagon, epinephrine, and cortisol together actually independently, don't have big effects on blood glucose, right? But when you start adding them together, like epinephrine and glucagon, well, the sum of those hormones can get a little higher. But check out when you have glucagon, epinephrine, and cortisol all at the same time, the sum of their effect on blood glucose is higher than the sum of their individual effects, right? If you have glucagon, epinephrine, and cortisol present simultaneously, you can get blood glucose much higher than you could just by adding the effect of glucagon, epinephrine, and cortisol individually on their blood glucose. Because that might only get you to here. If you added epinephrine, glucagon, cortisol individually, together they have synergistic effect where the sum of those hormones together gets you to a much higher blood glucose level. And when would you see a lot of these hormones being released, you guys? Cortisol is released during when? Stress. Same with epinephrine, right? And glucagon can be released during stress too. Yeah, so that makes sense. Yeah, if you're running from a bear, you're going to have a lot of these hormones being released during the stress response, which can get your blood sugar level to a much higher level than any of these other hormones independently. So that's kind of cool. That's called synergism. Now, antagonism is where you have hormones that can actually oppose the effects of hormones. So like if glucagon acts to raise blood sugar, what's the antagonistic hormone of glucagon? Insulin, right? Because insulin lowers blood sugar. Good. All right, cool, guys. So what we're going to do next is basically move on to talk about hypothalamic control of your endocrine system. And so the hypothalamus we talk about is the master control center of your endocrine system because it controls many of the hormones of your pituitary gland. So if the pituitary gland releases a lot of hormones that actually can influence like a lot of endocrine glands and tissues around your body, and the hypothalamus is the thing that controls that, that's why it's the master control center, because it controls the thing that controls other things in your body. It's kind of weird, but so the way that the hypothalamus is the master regulatory control center is that it releases regulatory hormones. Regulatory hormones include things like releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones. And what these do is they don't exert effects on peripheral tissues. Regulatory hormones and inhibitory hormones only exert effects on the anterior pituitary. Okay? That's its target tissue. So these hormones don't have to travel very far to their target tissue, but these can actually stimulate the release of other hormones or inhibit the release of hormones by the anterior pituitary. Whereas the posterior pituitary secretes oxytocin and vasopressin or antidiuretic hormone. These are not under the control of releasing or inhibiting hormones. Rather, these are synthesized and released by neurons of the hypothalamus directly into the posterior pituitary gland. So looking at this slide here, what we find is the hypothalamus, which sits right on the base of the third ventricle. And the hypothalamus has a variety of neurons or nuclei that control the release of hormones like regulatory hormones and releasing hormones that can affect your anterior pituitary gland, or neurons that have axons that go right down the infundibulum or stalk of your pituitary straight into the bloodstream here, where it can release those hormones right into blood. Now, what this slide shows are all of the regulatory hormones of the hypothalamus. We have CRH, GnRH, GHRH, TRH, and PRF. Let's go over these, you guys. Corticotropin releasing hormone. Well, cortico sounds like adrenal cortex. So corticotropin releasing hormone stimulates the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone from the anterior pituitary. How about GnRH, if it's called gonadotropic releasing hormone? Well, this stimulates the release of FSH and LH by the anterior pituitary. And then how about GHRH? Well, this is growth hormone releasing hormone. This stimulates the release of growth hormone by the anterior pituitary. Or prolactin releasing factor. This stimulates the release of prolactin by the anterior pituitary. Or TRH. Well, that stimulates the release of TSH by the anterior pituitary gland. So these hormones, their sole role is to basically influence the release of other hormones by the anterior pituitary gland. But we can also have inhibiting hormones, like we have growth hormone inhibiting hormone, as well as prolactin inhibiting hormone. When do you guys think growth hormone inhibiting hormone might be active? Like if you're inhibiting the release of growth hormone. Yeah, when you're adult, when you're no longer growing, like when you don't need to grow as much, exactly. Or how about prolactin inhibiting hormone? When would you not want to make breast milk? Yeah, when you currently don't have a newborn, or you're a male, right? If you're male and you don't need to be making a lot of prolactin to make breast milk, so males will secrete a lot of prolactin inhibiting factor. Now, the pituitary gland, also called the hypophysis, remember it's located in the sella turcica of your sphenoid bone, and so it's housed in this bony cavity. It's connected to the hypothalamus through an infundibulum or stalk. It has anterior and posterior portions, and the anterior pituitary gland is made of glandular tissue, the posterior pituitary gland is made of neural tissue. So we call the anterior pituitary gland as the adenohypophysis or glandular portion, and the posterior pituitary gland is also called the neurohypophysis or neural portion. There's also a little central region here where melanocyte-stimulating hormones released from, but we'll just consider that part of the anterior portion. Now, for the anterior pituitary, we got these three main areas. But what's important to note, you guys, is that the anterior pituitary gland receives signals from the hypothalamus. So the hormones that the hypothalamus releases, the regulatory hormones, those travel in this hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system to the anterior pituitary gland, where it stimulates the release of hormones by that gland. So what we see here then, you guys, is that the hypothalamus can release hormones into this blood system, the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system, where we have any of the RH hormones. So like CRH, GHRH, right? TRH, any of those released by the hypothalamus in the blood here can travel through these capillaries or blood vessels to the anterior pituitary gland where they're going to diffuse out of the blood vessels into the anterior pituitary gland and then stimulate these cells to release their respective hormone. This differs from the posterior pituitary gland, you guys, because you can see these blood vessels don't connect. So what we have here then is that neurons in the hypothalamus have axons that go down the infundibular stalk and then release their hormone directly into the bloodstream of the posterior pituitary gland. Now, for hormones of the anterior pituitary, we got TSH, prolactin, ACTH, GH, FSH, LH, and MSH. Okay, well, what do these do? Well, thyroid stimulating hormone, as the name implies, stimulates the thyroid gland. Prolactin stimulates the, not lactation, but it stimulates the production of milk in breast tissue. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, stimulates the release of hormones by the adrenal cortex. GH, or growth hormone, stimulates the release of certain hormones by your liver, but also the growth of skeletal tissues like bone, muscle, tendons, and ligaments. Follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone stimulate the release of hormones by your gonads, as well as the production of gametes. And then melanocyte-stimulating hormone, or MSH, stimulates the production of melanin by your melanocytes, or the ones you find in skin. So what hypothalamic hormone would stimulate the release of TSH by the anterior pituitary? TRH, good. Or what hypothalamic hormone would stimulate the release of ACTH from your anterior pituitary? CRH, good. How about FSH and LH from the anterior pituitary? GnRH, good. And how about growth hormone from the anterior pituitary? GHRH, right? Growth hormone, releasing hormone. Very good, you guys. So what we see here then is the anterior pituitary, and it releases a variety of hormones. What this shows, though, are the target tissues of those hormones. So what hormone has its target tissue as the gonads? What would you guys say? For the anterior pituitary. So what anterior pituitary hormone has its target tissue as the gonads?
FSH, LH.
Yeah, FSH and LH. How about as the melanocytes? MSH, good. How about the adrenal cortex? ACTH, good. How about breast tissue here, or mammary glands? Prolactin. How about the thyroid gland? TSH, good, from the anterior pituitary. And then how about like adipocytes and skeletal tissues? Growth hormone. Very good, you guys. And then what stimulated the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary were these regulatory hormones, right? So the hypothalamus releases regulatory hormones, which can stimulate or inhibit the release of hormones by the anterior pituitary. And then those hormones go on and have effects on peripheral tissues, which we can see here. Now, what's interesting, you guys, is that these hormones work in a negative feedback process. So that although TSH stimulates the release of thyroid hormone by the thyroid gland, it turns out that thyroid hormone can actually go back and inhibit the release of TRH and TSH by the anterior pituitary gland to prevent thyroid hormone from getting too high or too in excess. And we'll come back to that. Now, the posterior pituitary gland is made of neural tissue, and it releases oxytocin and vasopressin, also called antidiuretic hormone. And we have this hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract, which is basically axons from neurons of the hypothalamus that travel down the infundibular stalk and it releases hormones into blood vessels of the posterior pituitary gland. So it turns out we actually don't find any cell bodies in the posterior pituitary gland. Really all we find are axons, and they synapse directly on blood vessels there in the posterior pituitary gland. So what was the effect of oxytocin? Stimulates milk release by your mammary glands. Good. Uterine contractions. And it's released during the stress response or parabonding. Exactly. So you guys may have heard of women with newborns. If they hear a baby crying, even if it's not their own baby, like all of a sudden they start getting milk let down or milk release. So what that means then is that somehow in response to hearing a baby crying, that stimulates the release of oxytocin from neurons of your hypothalamus into the bloodstream, and then oxytocin then stimulates the release of milk by breast tissue. And it's hard to control that. It's under an unconscious process, right? It's kind of interesting. Now, what about antidiuretic hormone? Like, what's its effect? Actually, before I ask it, what's the target tissue of antidiuretic hormone? The kidneys, good. And so what does ADH do to the kidneys? Increases water reabsorption, good. And then what does ADH or vasopressin do to your blood vessels? Vasoconstrict. If you vasoconstrict, what does that do to your blood pressure? Increases blood pressure. Good. What this slide shows you guys is just a summary of those pituitary hormones like ACTH, FSH, LH, TSH, prolactin, and growth hormone. So those are released by the anterior pituitary gland. So what is the target tissue of ACTH again? Adrenal cortex. What about the target tissue of FSH and LH? Gonads. How about the target tissue for TSH? Thyroid gland, good. How about the target tissue for prolactin? Mammary glands, and it stimulates milk production, not letdown, but milk production. And then how about the target tissue for growth hormone? Skeletal tissues and adipose, good. Now, knowing that, we can make certain assumptions then about whether these hormones were in excess or if you're deficient, right? So what do you guys think would happen if growth hormone were secreted excessively by the pituitary gland? Yeah, you get a lot of growth in some way, right? How about if you get excessive release of prolactin? Sounds comical, but yes, you'd have like excessive milk production. Not even milk letdown, but milk production. How about if you had excessive release of TSH, which stimulates the thyroid gland? It would make your thyroid grow larger and stimulate the release of more thyroid hormone. We'll come back to that. All right, cool, you guys. So we're going to first talk about the thyroid gland as one of these target tissues of the pituitary. So it's one of the largest endocrine glands in your body, and it's located just inferior to your larynx or voice box. It's kind of a butterfly-shaped gland. There's two lobes. You got a right lobe and a left lobe, and they're connected by a central isthmus. Now, this is what the thyroid gland looks like here, just on the inferior part of your larynx. And in cadaver dissection, it's kind of butterfly-shaped. And the thyroid gland releases two main hormones, thyroid hormone and calcitonin, which do completely different things, but they're released by the cells of our thyroid gland. Now, if we look inside of our thyroid gland, what we find is that it's filled with a lot of fluid-filled spaces. So the thyroid gland's not totally solid. It's got a lot of fluid-filled spaces here called the thyroid follicles. So each of these thyroid follicles is lined with follicular cells, which are like a simple cuboidal type of cell. Now, technically, these aren't epithelial. They're not epithelial cells, but they have a shape of simple cuboidal. And then on the inside here, we have what we call colloid. Colloid is full of a lot of what we call thyroglobulin, which is the precursor to thyroid hormone. So in our thyroid gland, then, we got these follicles with follicular cells, which make thyroid hormone. But then on the inside here, we got all this fluid here that stores the precursor to thyroid hormone, which we call thyroglobulin. And thyroglobulin is basically a way to store a lot of iodine because it takes a tremendous amount of iodine to make thyroid hormone. In fact, like 99% of your body's iodine is found in the thyroid gland. So it's a very rich place of iodine. But the reason for this is that you need iodine to make thyroid hormone. Now, outside of this, we have what we call parafollicular cells. And these parafollicular cells of the thyroid release the hormone calcitonin. What calcitonin does is it actually helps to lower your blood calcium levels. So we have thyroid follicles. If you guys had to describe the structure of a thyroid follicle, like what does it look like inside the thyroid gland? The follicle. Yeah, it's a fluid-filled space, and it's lined with cells called follicular cells. And what's that fluid in the follicle filled with? Thyroglobulin, right? Which basically stores iodine. It's a precursor to thyroid hormone. Now, thyroid hormone has two main forms. We got T3 and T4. T3 is triiodothreonine. T4 is tetraiodоthreonine. T4 is 10 times less strong than T3. So T3 is 10 times more potent than T4 is what they say. So it would take 10 T4 molecules to exert the same effect as one T3 molecule. And the way you can change T3 and T4 is actually we have enzymes called deiodinases, which you find in tissues. And these deiodinases basically remove iodine from T4 to convert it into T3. T4 is what they call thyroxine. So if someone has hypothyroidism and they're taking thyroxine, that's T4. But T4 can be converted to T3 by enzymes called deiodinases in tissues, which can make T4 much more strong. Now, the regulation of thyroid hormone depends on a negative feedback loop, which is what we're seeing here. So the hypothalamus releases TRH. TRH stimulates the anterior pituitary gland to release TSH, and then TSH stimulates the thyroid gland to release TH. Now, thyroid hormone, its target tissue is basically almost every single cell in your body because you find thyroid hormone receptor on mitochondria, okay? And what thyroid hormone does is it regulates basal metabolic rate, or basically regulates the speed at which mitochondria generate ATP. So you can imagine then how important thyroid hormone is for our body, right? If it regulates the speed at which mitochondria make ATP, what do you guys think would happen if thyroid hormone were too low? Like you had very low thyroid hormone levels. You got it. Very slow metabolism. If your metabolism's slow, what starts happening to like your nervous system? Yeah, you kind of get slower reaction time, slower nervous system, maybe even lack of consciousness. What about muscle contractions? Yeah, less muscle contractions, so slower heart rate, weak heartbeats, slow, smooth muscle contractions, okay, and even slow skeletal muscle contractions, so decreased neuromuscular excitability. And opposite to that, you guys, what do you guys think would happen if thyroid hormone were in excess? If it controls metabolism, you get a really high level of thyroid hormone, what would happen to your metabolic rate? It would be fast, right? So if your metabolism's fast, what about your body temperature? You'd be hot. Yeah, you'd be running really hot. And if your metabolism's fast in your nervous tissue, you'd be really irritable, agitated, right? How about for your muscle tissue, like your heart rate? Be high, maybe beat too strongly. How about smooth muscle, like your gut? Also very fast, so you have like really fast GI motility, right? Now, one thing that actually prevents our thyroid hormone level from getting too high is the fact that thyroid hormone itself inhibits the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary from releasing their respective thyroid hormone, right? Now, I'm not talking about TH exactly. I'm just meaning like thyroid-related hormone. So when thyroid hormone levels get high enough, TH, the presence of it, actually inhibits the hypothalamus from releasing TRH. Or TH inhibits the anterior pituitary gland from releasing TSH. And so that's the negative feedback there, where once thyroid hormone levels get high enough, thyroid hormone itself prevents the further release of thyroid hormone. So your thyroid hormone levels should max out to a certain extent. That's why they don't get too high under normal circumstances. But what if you had a tumor of the thyroid gland where we're uncontrollably secreting thyroid hormone? Well, then this feedback process wouldn't work. You're just uncontrollably secreting thyroid hormone, then you're going to get those effects of hyperthyroidism, which would be hypermetabolism. So you're going to see excessive weight loss. You're going to see, really high body temperature and increased neuromuscular excitability. Makes sense. And what if I told you guys that most pituitary hormones work in a negative feedback process, including things like growth hormone, even like ACTH. So those all have negative feedback, and it prevents those hormones from getting too high or in excess too much. Now, the parafollicular cells of your thyroid gland release calcitonin, and calcitonin helps to lower blood calcium levels. You don't want hypercalcemia because that's going to cause reduced neuromuscular excitability. And the way that calcitonin stimulates decreases in blood calcium is it actually increases bone deposition, or it actually encourages bone to take calcium out of blood and put it into bone or store it in bone. And in fact, we know that bones are a reservoir of minerals like calcium. They can store calcium for later use. That makes sense. So what this slide here shows you guys just as a summary of thyroid hormone, calcitonin, and parathyroid hormone. But is parathyroid hormone released by the thyroid gland? No, it's released by the parathyroid glands, exactly. So what's the effect of thyroid hormone? Metabolic rate. So it regulates basal metabolic rate, right? So if you had really low thyroid hormone levels, then your metabolism would be low. If you had high thyroid hormone levels, your metabolism would be high. How about calcitonin? What does it do? Reduces blood calcium by encouraging deposition of calcium into bone, so you can store calcium in bone, or discouraging the reabsorption of calcium by your kidneys. Makes sense. That way you pee out more calcium. And then your parathyroid hormones are antagonistic to calcitonin. So what parathyroid hormone does is it actually increases blood calcium, and it does this in 3 ways. Parathyroid hormone encourages the reabsorption of calcium in your kidney filtrate. That we don't lose it. That's why we don't lose it in urine. It encourages your kidneys to release vitamin D, which then encourages calcium reabsorption in the gut, and it also stimulates osteoclasts to break down bone and release calcium into your bloodstream. So the parathyroid glands you find just on the posterior part of your thyroid gland. It's made of chief cells and oxyphil cells. Oxyphil cells have kind of more of an unknown function. What we care about here are the chief cells, which release parathyroid hormone. The way that they release parathyroid hormone is different, though. You don't have a pituitary hormone that stimulates parathyroid hormone release. Instead, these chief cells can measure the concentration of calcium in your blood. When blood calcium levels get too low, these chief cells then release parathyroid hormone in your bloodstream, and it stimulates those effects we talked about. So you find the parathyroid glands just in the posterior part of the thyroid. They release parathyroid hormone into our bloodstream, and it stimulates the breakdown of bone by stimulating osteoclasts. So that makes sense. If osteoclasts are breaking down bone, they're going to start to release more calcium into your bloodstream. Parathyroid hormone also stimulates kidneys to reabsorb calcium and release vitamin D, activated vitamin D, calcitriol. And that not only helps increase calcium by reabsorbing it and preventing it from being in your urine, but also promotes calcium absorption in the gut, because that's what vitamin D does. It actually promotes absorption of calcium by the food you eat. And that's why you need that. So parathyroid hormone has those 3 effects. Knowing that parathyroid hormone normally acts to raise your blood calcium levels, what do you guys think would happen if someone had a tumor of parathyroid hormone and they had hyperparathyroidism? You got it, hypercalcemia. And what's the effect of hypercalcemia? Yeah, very good. Reduced neuromuscular excitability. And what about your bones? If someone had a secreting tumor of parathyroid hormone, over time, not immediately, but chronically, what would happen to their bones? Yeah, brittling of bone, right? So osteoporosis. And then what do you guys think would happen to vitamin D levels? They'd also be elevated too. Exactly. Cool. Good job, you guys. All right, so we're going to pick up here on the adrenal glands. And I like to think about the adrenal glands as like the hats on top of the kidneys. They're even kind of shaped like a little triangular pyramidal hat. So you have one adrenal gland on top of each kidney. They're not technically part of the kidney. That's a common misconception. They're actually separate from the kidney. They just happen to be somewhat attached to it by a little bit of connective tissue. Now, we also call these the suprarenal glands because they're above the kidneys. And the adrenal glands have 2 main layers. We got adrenal cortex and an adrenal medulla. Now, you can see the adrenal glands here. They actually have their own blood supply from the abdominal aorta or branches of the renal artery too. Now, these adrenal glands are just glandular tissue on top of each kidney. And you can see in dissection, they don't look like a whole lot, just kind of like some loose flat-ish tissue on top of a kidney here. Now, in cross-section, we can see the two main layers. So that we have the cortex out here and the medulla. What's interesting is these layers are made of different types of tissue, and they also secrete different hormones. The adrenal cortex is made of more of a glandular type of tissue, whereas the adrenal medulla is made of a type of tissue that's derived from nervous tissue. So the adrenal medulla is more like neurons. And so what this means is if you have a disease that affects neurons, it may also affect the adrenal medulla, but not the adrenal cortex, because embryologically, the medulla comes from nervous tissue. The cortex comes from glandular tissue. So the adrenal cortex, we can divide it into three main layers. We got the zona glomerulosa, fasciculata, and reticularis, whereas the medulla just has what we call chromaffin cells, and those release the catecholamines. Now, the adrenal cortex is derived from mesoderm, makes glandular tissue. It's stimulated by ACTH from the anterior pituitary. So the anterior pituitary releases ACTH. It stimulates the release of corticosteroids, mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, and gonatocorticoids, which are basically just hormones that go on to exert different effects. Corticosteroids and glucocorticoids are stress hormones, and they include things like cortisol, which plays a role in the stress response. So cortisol inhibits your immune system, but it also raises blood sugar. Mineralocorticoids include ones like aldosterone. Aldosterone we talked about as helping with sodium reabsorption and potassium secretion. And the gonatocorticoids include androgens like testosterone. So another place of androgens is actually the adrenal cortex, which is interesting. Now, the adrenal medulla comes from neural crest cells. So it actually is made of neural tissue. It has chromaffin cells that are excited by preganglionic neurons of your autonomic nervous system. So there's actually neurons that go into the adrenal medulla, and they excite these chromaffin cells to release catecholamines. And these catecholamines include things like epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are basically sympathetic hormones that aid in the sympathetic response, right? So like increasing blood pressure, increasing blood glucose, and increasing neuromuscular excitability. Now, the adrenal cortex has those three layers. We've got zona glomerulosa, fasciculata, and reticularis. The zona glomerulosa produces the mineralocorticoids like aldosterone. And what was the effect of aldosterone again on your kidney? Sodium reabsorption and potassium secretion. And they only work in that way. So if you reabsorb one sodium, you will secrete a potassium. Or if you secrete potassium, you will reabsorb sodium. And they're coupled. Like you can't separate those two. So let's say if your potassium levels are high and you start releasing aldosterone to secrete potassium, well, you're going to have sodium reabsorption with that. Or let's say if your sodium levels were low and you start releasing aldosterone to increase sodium reabsorption, well, you're going to get potassium secretion with that. So they always work in that process. Now, fasciculata here releases the glucocorticoids like corticosterone or cortisol. This is a stress hormone. And the zona reticularis releases the gonatocorticoids, which are androgens like testosterone. And so all of these have different effects. So we talked about how the mineralocorticoids like aldosterone are involved in regulating electrolyte homeostasis and water balance. We know that if aldosterone is involved with sodium reabsorption and that water follows solutes, well, if you're reabsorbing more sodium, then you're also going to hold on to more water. So we know that aldosterone is part of the RAAS, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, which acts to raise your blood pressure because it helps you retain more water by retaining more sodium. The glucocorticoids include cortisol, and targets include things like the liver, and it helps to raise blood glucose levels. But it also has an interesting effect on your immune system because glucocorticoids or cortisol in the long term actually inhibit your immune system from functioning properly, which is why if people are on like a glucocorticoid or if they're stressed, they're more likely to get ill or sick. The gonatocorticoids help release androgens, and typically they don't have effect until menopause or andropause. And this is one of the main sources of androgens after menopause or andropause. Andropause is male menopause. Menopause is just female menopause, right? Where you have no longer you don't have an ovarian cycle anymore. So, but you can still get some sex hormones from the adrenal cortex in that regard. And then epinephrine and norepinephrine, which come from the adrenal medulla, they're involved with helping to aid in the sympathetic response. Now, we talk about hyposecretion and hypersecretion disorders, like Addison's disease or hypertension or Cushing's syndrome. We'll come back to these in the next chapter where we talk about disorders of the endocrine system. Now, the adrenal medulla has these chromaffin cells which release norepinephrine and epinephrine. These are sympathetic hormones that aid in the sympathetic response. Remember the fight-flight system. So if you have excesses in norepinephrine and epinephrine, then you're going to see an exaggerated sympathetic response, right? Like tachycardia, high blood pressure, hypertension, hypermetabolism, sweating or diaphoresis, that kind of stuff. Now, the next endocrine gland we're going to talk about is the pancreas. And the pancreas we talked about as being just posterior to the stomach. It's retroperitoneal, and it's also very loose. This is why we talked about how pancreatic cancers were fatal, because the tissue didn't have a very strong capsule around it. So it's easy for these cells to metastasize or spread throughout the body. Now, most of the pancreatic cells are the acini, which have an exocrine function, or basically secretory function that aids in digestion. The remaining 1 to 2% of pancreatic cells you find in what are called pancreatic islets are the islets of Langerhans. And these actually have alpha cells, beta cells, and delta cells. And these actually secrete hormones. So they're actually endocrine cells that help regulate things like blood glucose homeostasis. So looking at the pancreas here, it's kind of a fish-shaped gland. We have a head, a body, and a tail. Tail's over by the spleen side, head's over by the duodenum. And we've talked about the pancreas's role in digestion previously. Now, inside the pancreas, we find these rare islands of cells, the pancreatic islets. In fact, if you look here, you can see that the tissue even looks different than the surrounding tissue. So, sort of lighter little circle of tissue is the pancreatic islet. It's full of alpha cells, beta cells, delta cells, and F cells. Alpha cells release the hormone glucagon, which aids in increasing blood sugar. Beta cells release the hormone insulin, which aids in decreasing blood sugar. Delta cells release somatostatin, which actually inhibits the release of glucagon and insulin from alpha and beta cells. And then F cells release pancreatic polypeptide, which also plays a role in regulatory functions. So alpha cells release glucagon, and as a hormone, what does glucagon do? Increases blood sugar, yeah, and its target tissue is the liver and skeletal muscle, because it actually aids in glycogenolysis, the breakdown of glycogen into glucose to raise your blood sugar. But it also has, one of its targets is adipose, because it also increases the concentration of free fatty acids. So glucagon can increase your free fatty acids, which is just more energy for your body cells. What about the target tissues for insulin released by beta cells? Like, what's the effect of insulin, actually? Decreases blood sugar, and it helps to lower blood sugar by aiding in the absorption of sugar from blood into some of your body's cells. Target tissues include most tissue or cells in your body other than your brain, skeletal muscle, and liver. Now, delta cells are somatostatin. In fact, somatostatin, another word for this, you guys, is growth hormone inhibiting hormone. But what somatostatin does, it actually inhibits the release of glucagon and insulin. So I like to think about somatostatin as like the, like the referee in this whole system. You know, because if glucagon's acting to increase blood sugar and insulin's acting to lower blood sugar, somatostatin's in between the two, like, hey, you guys, hold on. So it actually prevents the release of glucagon and insulin. That's what somatostatin does. It kind of makes these wild fluctuations in blood glucose less pronounced by inhibiting the hormones that change blood glucose. Kind of makes sense. Like, it helps plateau blood glucose levels. And then pancreatic polypeptide also plays a role in regulating blood glucose, but more in a complex way. Now, what this table shows you guys are these hormones and what their effects are. So we talk about how glucagon helps to increase blood sugar by acting on the liver and adipose, and it increases blood glucose levels. Insulin helps to decrease blood sugar by acting on some of your body cells in the liver, and it does this by actually aiding in the transport of glucose from blood into your body cells. Somatostatin slows the release of insulin and glucagon, and therefore prevents any wild fluctuations in blood sugar. And then pancreatic polypeptide just plays a role in regulating things like somatostatin. So it has more of a regulatory function as well. Now we'll talk about some of the hypo and hypersecretion disorders of glucagon, insulin, and somatostatin later, because you can get things like hypoglycemia or hyperglycemia, or we have diabetes, and there's different types of diabetes depending on the result of this insufficiency of insulin or excess of insulin. We'll come back to that later. Now, the pineal gland, we talked about, as you find the epithalamus, it releases the hormone melatonin, and melatonin is involved in regulating cycles, including the sleep-wake cycle. But we know that there are lots of different types of cycles in our body, things like body temperature cycles, blood pressure cycles, even sexual cycles, right? Like, it's believed that melatonin may actually stimulate puberty because it helps regulate cycles. And what's interesting, you guys, is that the pineal gland has cells that sort of release hormones in a very specific time-dependent manner. And there's these interesting feedback loops where your cells can actually tell time using chemical reactions. Now, it's kind of weird, but that's how these cycles are regulated. You know, we know what our time is because we can look at the tools we use to measure time, whether it's, you know, clues in our environment or, you know, watches, that kind of stuff. Otherwise, our body measures time through chemical reactions, things that occur in the pineal gland. And I don't want to get into that now, but if you're interested, that would be a great research topic. But melatonin's involved with, like, circadian rhythm, which is the sleep-wake cycle. So if you guys ever wondered, like, why is it that how maybe you can wake up at a specific moment in time without your alarm even going off in the morning? Well, your body, you know, knows to wake up at a certain time because, in part, there's melatonin cycles that help regulate this. Or like how you feel tired at a specific time in the evening. That's regulated by melatonin. Now, the thymus is another one of those ancillary endocrine tissues that you find just on the anterior surface of the heart. Now, it functions in maturing the immune system. So this is where T cells mature prior to puberty. And the thymus releases a hormone called thymosin, which aids in the maturation of T cells. So it's plays a very important role in your immune system. In fact, I just learned about a new research study where they're actually looking at how the thymus regulates T cell maturation. And if you can somehow trick the thymus into maturing certain types of T cells that attack cancer, this may be a new type of cancer therapy. Now, what this slide shows you guys are just some of the different organs and tissues around your body that release hormones. Like your kidneys release calcitriol, which is vitamin D3, or erythropoietin. What did erythropoietin do? EPO. Stimulates red blood cell production by red bone marrow. There's one more not up here too, you guys. Renin. What did renin do as secreted by the kidneys? Stimulates the RAAS. Is that what you said? Okay, cool. And so then if it stimulates the RAAS, then you're making more angiotensin 2, and the angiotensin 2 raises blood pressure. How about your heart releases atriopeptin, or atrial natriuretic peptide? Remember, the atria could release this hormone if there's too much stretch on your atria, and it actually inhibited your kidneys from being able to reabsorb sodium. That way you can help eliminate more water and lower your blood pressure. There's lots of hormones released by your GI tract. Like we already talked about gastrin and cholecystokinin and gastric inhibitory peptide and secretin. There's other ones like ghrelin. Ghrelin's involved with satiety. It's kind of interesting. And there's leptin too. It's also involved with satiety. Now, we know that the gonads, like ovaries and testes, release a variety of hormones like estrogen and progesterone, or androgens. And then those play different roles, like in promoting secondary sex characteristics or helping to mature sex cells or gametes. And we talked a little bit about that back in the reproductive chapter.